Good morning, church family. Hope you've had a great weekend. I think this week is a 6-month anniversary since the start of this class. So we've been going at this for quite a while now. We've managed to cover most of 3 years, or 3 plus, I guess, years of ministry for Jesus. We are now in his final week. Not in our final week. It's going to take us a few more weeks to get through this. Last week, we had Jesus entering Jerusalem on a Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday, they call it Palm because they covered his walkway, his pathway, with palm branches as he rode into the temple, the city, on a donkey. And then he was there at the temple for a while. He left the temple, and according to Luke, every night he left the temple and he went to Bethany on the Mount of Olives. So we're going to start this week with Jesus leaving Bethany and coming back into Jerusalem on a Monday. Any questions before we start? Nope. So, to continue what we started last week, whenever there's a change to the timeline, I will highlight that in red to let you know we are changing the time, the day. And so we were in Sunday. Mark says the next day, as they were leaving Bethany. Now that could be the next Jewish day or the next Roman day if all we had was Mark's comment there. But Matthew says early in the morning as Jesus was on his way back to the city. So early in the morning is the new Roman day. And Mark, in fact, is writing to the Romans, so he would tend to be referring to a Roman day anyway. But what you will notice with Mark is he doesn't use the term the next day very often. He tends to use the morning or the evening. This time he uses the next day. So we are on a new day. It's light because it's morning, but the Jewish day hasn't changed yet because it changed over at midnight the night before. Just to refresh your mind on the geography here, this is Bethany, over here on the far right. To get to Jerusalem, which is here, now this is the old city walls of Jerusalem, the city of David, if you will, the city of David walls. To get there, you're in Bethany, you're going to climb uphill to Bethphage, and we're going to talk a lot more about Bethphage in a minute, and continue to climb until you get to the peak. This is a ridge going up and down here. This is the peak. It's typically called the Mount of Olives, although this entire ridge is often called the Mount of Olives. We'll see an example of that this morning. Then you climb back down the ridge, or down the hill. On the side of the hill is the garden that we call the Garden of Gethsemane. Until you get down into the valley, and this is the Kidron Valley, this brown here. And then you climb back up to get into, this is the actual Temple Mount. Now this is modern day satellite, so this is the Muslim Temple Mount, but it's located on the same site as the Temple of Solomon. Any questions there? Okay, so let's talk about Bethphage. The word Bethphage, Beth being house or place, phage, this is a place of young figs. That's what the Aramaic name for Bethphage is. There are 2 pronunciations for this. One common one, which I don't use very often, is Bethphage, or Bethphage, capital A. And I'll tell you why I use one over the other. It has nothing to do with religious preferences or anything like that. When I was working, I was a microbiologist. A phage for a microbiologist is a virus that infects bacteria. I did some study on phages when I was a much younger scientist. And so I just have the preference of the word phage over phagy, and so I pronounce the city Bethphage. But both pronunciations are correct, are commonly used, and so if you go into literature and you see Bethphage, we're talking about the same place. Now, Bethphage is referred to in several secular documents that we're aware of today. The first one is the Jewish Talmud, and in this particular incident, I'm talking about a document about 100 AD, so first century, but about 70 years after Christ. And in the Jewish Talmud is written by rabbis. It is not considered an inspired text. It's written by men in fact, it's the Jewish law code, if you will, that's outside of the law of Moses. And in fact, this is what Jesus has been criticizing his entire ministry, is these priestly, rabbinic, well, priestly is the right word, the priestly laws that they've placed on top of the law of Moses. That's contained in this Jewish Talmud. But mentioned in the Jewish Talmud is Bethphage, and they say that it's within a Sabbath day's walk from Jerusalem. And we talked about a Sabbath day's walk last class, and depending on the time frame and depending on which document you look at, it's somewhere between a half mile and 2 miles, depending on who the chief priest is at the time. So in 100 AD, Bethphage is considered within a Sabbath day's walk from Jerusalem. It's described as being surrounded by a wall, and it's a place where the Jerusalem Sanhedrin meet. Now, the Sanhedrin is typically the Sadducees. You may recall that during the Greek occupation of this area, the Sadducees were in control of the temple, but when Herod came in, he kicked the Sadducees out and he brought the Pharisees in. So the Pharisees are running the temple. The Sadducees can't be running around in the temple. So they've moved over to Bethphage, and that is where the Sanhedrin meets, the Jewish Sanhedrin. Now, it's also mentioned in another document, which you may be familiar with. Josephus, a Jewish scholar, a Jewish general in the army, was captured by the Romans, but instead of being killed, he was allowed to live as long as he would help the Romans in understanding Jewish culture, Jewish law, etc. So he was allowed to write. In fact, he was encouraged to write, and he wrote a large volume of Antiquities of the Jews in 93 AD. And he mentions Bethphage, and he calls it a walled village, consistent with what we saw in the Talmud. One of two places where the Jerusalem Sanhedrin convened, so again, consistent with the Talmud. Just east of the outer camp of Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. So certainly Josephus didn't consider the peak as the Mount of Olives. He considered the entire ridge as the Mount of Olives. And we saw Luke did that last week as well. He considered the entire ridge as being the Mount of Olives. And he says it contained archival rooms for the housing of the judicial books, the law, and 22 of the Old Testament canon. Well, there are 24 of the Old Testament canon that we recognize today. The 22 that he includes here were all of them except for Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs. Those were the two that he did not include in this 22. In addition, he writes that Bethphage is the place where people could be cleared of impurities before entering the house of God, or prevented altogether from entering God's house if their pedigrees were not to God's liking. So with regard to Passover, Passover is an important event. People want to go to the temple. They want to participate in the activities. So 6 to 7 days or so before Passover, crowds of impure people, people who are not clean, would come to Bethphage in order to be cleansed before the Passover. So this would be a popular place at that particular time. So why do we spend all this time talking about Bethphage? It has to do with the next event that's coming up. Jesus is leaving Bethany. He's going to the Mount of Olives. He's going to pass through Bethphage. And he curses a fig tree. Bethphage, the place of figs. Where did this place occur? The Bible doesn't say it's at Bethphage, but it does say the next day as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry, seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf. So he's at Bethphage, he's looking uphill. He's in Bethany, he's looking up here, there's Bethphage, the place of figs, and he sees a fig tree. He went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves because it was not the season for figs, and we'll talk about that for a second. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again," and his disciples heard him say it. By the way, what I should have mentioned and I've missed it was that this event was recorded by both Mark and Luke, and there are some minor differences in their account. And that's why I've broken them apart here. So some notes about Mark's account. Mark says that it wasn't the season for figs, and in fact that is true. Figs are a summer fruit, not a spring fruit. The Passover's in the spring, so you wouldn't expect that a fig tree during Passover would have any figs on it. It was a little early for the figs. And I think I already mentioned this. Leaving Bethany, seeing in the distance, well, you're in Bethany, you're going uphill, you look at the distance, there's Bethphage and the place of figs. One other thing is that Mark splits the act of cursing the fig tree and the disciples noticing of that into 2 days, Monday and a Tuesday. In just a second, we're going to read Matthew's account, and he lumps the two together. And I'm going to discuss that a little bit more when we get to Matthew's account. And getting to Matthew's account, early in the morning, as Jesus was on his way back to the city, now Matthew doesn't say he was at Bethphage, but it was in Bethany, but both Mark and Luke let us know that he was in Bethany. He was hungry. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." Immediately, the tree withered. When the disciples saw this, they were amazed. "How did the fig tree wither so quickly?" they asked. Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done for the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer." I believe, we're going to see Mark's account of Peter noticing the fig tree being withered next week. Mark places the notice of the fig tree withered on the Tuesday. Matthew records it here. Some Bible scholars take this discrepancy, if you want to call it that, I don't call it that, and I'll tell you why in just a second, as evidence of errors in the Bible. When I say some scholars, I meant Bible critics. I want to make a few notes about that because, in my opinion, that's a wrong way of looking at this. If you remember Mark's account, Mark doesn't state when the tree withered. but he does say that they noticed it, Peter notices it the next day. Matthew says that it withered immediately, but he doesn't tell you when the disciples saw this. It just says when the disciples saw it. So in my opinion, these are consistent with each other. There is not a discrepancy here. Mark doesn't say when the tree withers. Matthew says it does immediately, so therefore it happened immediately. Mark says that they noticed it, specifically Peter, notices it the next day. Matthew doesn't tell you when the disciples saw it. He just says when the disciples saw it. So there's no real discrepancy here, number one. Number two, we have seen example after example after example where Matthew likes to lump things together. This is his writing style. It's his preferred writing style. He doesn't necessarily do things chronologically. He lumps things together as they fit so that he can tell his story all in one compact area. Mark, we have seen over and over and over again, tends to write in a chronological order. Those are both of their writing styles. They are both being consistent in here, and they were both inspired to do it this way. So, again, in my opinion, no discrepancy. They are very consistent with each other. Any questions on that? We're going to see Mark's version of this when we get to Tuesday. Okay, good. So the next event is Jesus clears the temple. Again, Mark places this event on the same day that Jesus curses the fig tree. Matthew places the event the day before, and we talked about that last week, just after Jesus enters the temple on the donkey. Luke mentions the event, but doesn't indicate the day the event occurs, and Luke doesn't mention the fig tree at all. In addition, John doesn't record the event at all. Now, he does record another temple clearing event, but when John records it, it's in the first year of Jesus' ministry. So Jesus, in his first year, goes up, clears out the temple, and according to Mark and Matthew, late in his ministry, he comes in and he clears out the temple again. Different events. Now, Mark, Matthew, and Luke's accounts are very similar, so I've combined them together here, and I'll tell you by underlining where one has inserted a thought and the others have omitted the thought. So on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were, and Mark and Matthew insert, buying and then all three of them have selling there. And then Mark and Matthew insert, we overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. That last part being Mark only. And then this second part here, they are all very, in fact, they are extremely consistent with each other on this next couple of sentences. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." Now the part that's in black is a reference to previous Messianic prophecy. Isaiah 56:7, "For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." This first part here. And then Jeremiah 7 verse 11, "Has the house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you?" And again, all three authors were consistent and were inspired to refer back to both of those. This next part here, Matthew's the only one to include this, and as we read through it, I think you will immediately figure out why this was important for Matthew to include and why Luke and Mark did not include it. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple courts, "Hosanna to the Son of David," a phrase that has a lot of meaning to the Jewish audience, not so much to a Roman or a Greek audience. They were indignant. "Do you hear what these children are saying?" they asked him. "Yes," replied Jesus. "Have you never read, 'From the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise'?" This appears to be a reference to Psalms 8, verse 2. I've taken this particular from the Living Bible because it's the one that most closely matches what Matthew has here. "You have taught the little children to praise you perfectly. May their example shame and silence your enemies." So the next event, the religious leaders plot to kill Jesus. Now these authors have been mentioning this over and over and over again. This was a daily event during this last week. Mark and Luke record this event, I'm sorry, I said Mark and Matthew. It's Mark and Luke have recorded this event. Slightly different. Where Matthew recorded the piece about the children at this point, Mark and Luke record the religious leaders. In Mark, the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teachings. In Luke, every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find a way to do it because all the people hung on his words. They can't just go out and grab Jesus and string him up when you got crowds of people there that are listening to every word he says. And then Mark, and you notice Mark is the one that seems to be timing this so far. Now, it's going to change here, but in these early days, Mark is the one that gives us the time clues. There it is. So Mark 11, verse 19, when evening came, so next Jewish day, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. So we go from Monday light to Monday night, but because it's after sunset, we've now changed the Jewish day. It's now Aviv 12 or Nisan 11. Any questions there? Okay. And then Mark turns around in the very next verse and says, in the morning, as they went along. So now we have changed the Roman day from Monday to Tuesday. It's now light, but we are still in the same Jewish day, which started at sunset the previous Roman day. Any questions there? So now we're into Tuesday. So now Peter notices the withered fig tree. We just talked about the fig tree a few minutes ago. Mark. In the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered. Have faith in God, Jesus answered. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in their hearts, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins. I underlined that because that's it's an insertion from, Mark wrote his first. It is there, but Matthew did not have that sentence. And just to refresh your memory, Matthew says, when the disciples saw this, so he didn't give a time frame, they were amazed. How did the fig tree wither so quickly, they asked. And Jesus replied, I truly tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but also you can say to the mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. So the next event is that the religious leaders questioned Jesus' authority. It was recorded by Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and their accounts are nearly identical, so we'll just read it. While Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law together with the elders came up to him. Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? They said. Who gave you this authority? He replied, I will also ask you a question. Tell me. John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he will ask, why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, all the people will stone us because they are persuaded that John was a prophet. So they answered, we don't know where it came from. Jesus said, neither will I tell you what authority I am doing these things. You will see a pattern. When Jesus is talking to believers, he's very upfront, close, and he will give signs. He will answer their questions. When he's talking to unbelievers, he won't give you a sign, and he doesn't answer your questions. You might say he doesn't waste his time trying to answer questions to those that don't believe.
I think it was a pretty good strategy.
Yeah, why get into an argument?
Back on their back.
Yeah,
They could say that it was one thing because then they would be expected to honor him. And they could say it was the other way because the people believed it was.
exactly.
He did a pretty good strategy.
Mhm. I agree. And he was consistent in his ability to go around the Pharisees. Say again?
That's why they call him the master.
The masterful teacher. Yeah. I wish I could be as clever. And Jesus tells a parable of the two sons, and Matthew is the only gospel author to record this. And as we read through it, you'll be able to tell me why Matthew was the only one who was inspired to include this. What do you think? There was a man who had two sons. He went to the first and said, Son, go and work today in the vineyard. I will not, he answered. But later, he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and said the same thing. He answered, I will, sir, but he did not go. Which of the two did what the father wanted? The first, they answered. Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. Now, remember who he's talking to now. He's talking to the chief priests and the Pharisees, etc. For John came to you to show you the way of the righteous, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes did. And even after you saw this, you did not repent and believe him. So very appropriate for a Jewish audience, would have been lost on a Roman or a Greek audience. Yeah, I got time. So the next event is Jesus tells a parable of the tenants. The event was recorded by Mark and Matthew and Luke. The three accounts are very similar, and so again, I've combined the accounts, and I'll underline when one or more of the authors is slightly different than the other. So a man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. And that was Mark and Matthew only on that particular sentence. We'll pause here for a second and say, if you go to Israel today and you go south of Jerusalem into the range, the mountain range there, some call it the West Bank, or part of the West Bank, there are still remnants of Jewish vineyards there today. And you will see in those vineyards on the side of the hill, particularly the western side of the hill, that when there's a vineyard, there is a wall, there is a dug-in wine press, and there are watchtowers there. So the remnants of this are still there today. You can still see those events. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. In that event, start thinking about prophets. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance." So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, they replied, and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. Jesus said to them, "Have you ever read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Mark and Matthew recorded that last sentence. This appears to be a reference to Psalms 118, verses 22 through 23. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Mark being Jewish, Matthew being Jewish, would recognize immediately the importance to that. Luke, being Greek, Gentile, was not inspired to include that. Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of heaven will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. So that sounds like the kingdom of heaven will be taken from you. Who's that? The Jewish people, and given to a people who will produce its fruit, the Gentiles. Anyone who falls on this stone will be broken and to pieces. Anyone to whom it falls will be crushed. That was Matthew and Luke. Religious leaders looked for a way to rest Jesus, recorded by Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And again, the accounts are incredibly similar, so I've just recorded it here for you. Then the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parables against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. Religious leaders questioned Jesus about paying taxes. And obviously, I need to do some editing on my slides. Again, recorded by Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Slightly different, so I will let you know what the differences are. Later, they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. Now, we know who the Pharisees are. They're a sect, if you will, of the Jewish, but who are the Herodians? Herod came in. He was Jewish, but he was favored by the Romans, so they put him into power. And so the Herodians was another sect, if you will, separate from the Pharisees, but who were loyal not necessarily to the Jewish faith, but to Herod himself. So what Mark and Matthew and Luke are describing here is that not only did the Pharisees, the chief priests, the people that were in charge of the temple, who were loyal to Herod, not only did they come, but people that were loyal strictly to Herod also came to try to trap Jesus. In Matthew, then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Luke's account. Keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretend to be sincere. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said, so that they might land him over to the power and authority of the governor. So Luke doesn't specifically mention the Herodians, but he says spies and governor, which is Herod. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. But you aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Jesus' response as recorded by Mark. But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. Why are you trying to trap me? He said. Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. They brought the coin, and he asked them, whose image is this and whose inscription? Matthew. But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, so Mark says hypocrisy, Matt says evil intent. You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin, said a denarius, used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius and asked them, whose image is this and whose inscription? Luke, he saw through their duplicity, so evil intent, hypocrisy, Luke calls it duplicity, and said to them, show me a denarius, whose image and inscription is on it. Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, go give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away. Another great example of the masterful teacher there. He knew he could see right into their trap, and he found a way to throw it right back at them. Next event. Religious leaders questioned Jesus about marriage and resurrection. So you can see what's going on here. We back up to Passover. So on day 10, the Passover lamb is selected, and it is slaughtered on day 14. But in the meantime, that Passover lamb is examined thoroughly to make sure it has no blemishes, because you do not want to use a blemished lamb as part of the Passover. In a similar manner here, Jesus is being examined thoroughly by the Pharisees over and over and over. And every time he's passing that test. Now, they're thinking in one way, and God's using what the Pharisees are doing as part of the test of Jesus, the Passover lamb.
This is where the Jewish Talmud truly messed with their minds, and they tested, can a man put away his wife for many reasons. The Talmud had hundreds of itemized listings of what excuses a man could use to put his wife away, not contained in the law of Moses. So the strict interpreter sees a very few ways, and the more generous one, the Talmud, anything goes. Burnt toast, for example.
Exactly. There were two groups of mind. There were two major trains of thought within the Jewish education system, if you will. And one train of thought was, you can divorce your wife for any reason whatsoever, and that is exactly the way they put it. And the other one was, no, you can only divorce your wife in matters of infidelity. And that's what this whole question is about, and we'll finish this question and then we'll quit. So they're trying to trap Jesus into one position or another. That same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and the third brother, right on down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7? Whose wife will she be of the 7? Since all of them were married to her. And Jesus replied, you are in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now, Jesus did not say they will be angels. They said they would be like the angels in that they will not be married. There's a lot of controversy on that passage. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. I'm going to stop there. Any questions or comments? Hearing none then, let's get